We're now moving on to the A at the bottom of the guitar, 5th fret. It's on the E string, and that means that we're going to have a new mode that we're going to be centering around, which is going to be the Aeolian mode. But remember, we're measuring the Aeolian mode here from the bottom of the guitar, which many people don't understand or don't do all the time. Now, some people might, because some people might be working from music theory kind of worksheets or fretboards, which have a tablature with this string on top. So the high-pitched string is on top of the worksheet, in which case you might, from a natural English reading standpoint, go from top to bottom, left to right, and work on these high strings first, the high-pitched strings first. But I think most people will likely learn the top or heavy strings on the guitar and then learn chord constructions related to those heavy strings, which is great, but it makes it a little bit more difficult to then record or make chords from the bottom of the guitar, in particular because you have to deal with, on the bottom of the guitar more often, the fault line, because these two strings are shifted forward. We also are not good oftentimes as guitarists to try to build a chord when the root note is at the bottom of the guitar, because then I have to look for inverse intervals in order to see what I need to pick up above that position, because we usually just learn shapes, and we learn them like we learn the alphabet from top to bottom going in one direction, and we just don't realize that we haven't really learned it like in its totality. We just say, we know the alphabet, but we don't know it backwards that well because we haven't practiced it backwards. And so similarly on the fretboard, we know it from top to bottom, left to right typically, because that's how we play, and we learn it sequentially in that way. In other words, I don't know what comes before W without singing the song, right? I can't go backwards really easily from any point. And that's a huge restraint or constraint when we're playing the guitar. There's only, it only goes from A to G, although there's sharps and flats that confuse things. But to really understand it, to really be able to move as best we can, we would like to be able to do it upwards, backwards, see it by shape, see it by interval. And that's what we'll be working on from the bottom of the guitar. So let's get a quick recap as to what our kind of overall objective is, which we've gone over a few times now. So I also just want to be thinking a little bit more about why we want to learn, the modes again, and build upon the theory that I kind of talked about last time in our intro when we were talking about the G, which in our case here is the Mixolydian. So remember, what we're doing is we're looking at the A Aeolian, which I can compare to the major scale, remembering a lot of people don't do it with the A Aeolian because the way we think about things in Western music is typically there's a scale, and we might just call it a scale because we just think that's the major scale. But the scale is just one of the modes. The scale is, from a modal perspective, an Ionian mode. From a modal perspective, there's nothing special about it. It's just one construction of, it's just looking at the same notes that are in a line from a different perspective. It's just like looking at the alphabet, but instead of starting at A, which is our convention, we started at W, and then we counted around the alphabet in a circle, right? It's the same thing. It's just from a different perspective. So that's going to be the Aeolian mode, but we learn everything in the major scale, and then we compare things to it. But most of the time, a lot of times people learn then the Aeolian, which we think about as though it's completely separate from the major scale. We call that the minor scale. And we say, what are we trying to learn? We're trying to learn the major scale, usually thought of and discussed as though we're going to play that when we're trying to play something happy, which I think goes back to the old convention back, when they were playing in like trying to tell a story in like a symphony or in an opera. It makes perfect sense to say, like, if I'm trying to tell a story with music, which is a cool, really cool thing to do, right? We're trying to make a picture in your mind with the music, then I'm going to run in, I can't do it perfectly, right? I'm going to run into problems. I can't say, and, the lady ran down the street, but then was robbed by someone and she felt sad or something like that. I can't really do that perfectly, obviously, with music, but what I can do is I can come up with conventions, right? And so notice the conventions aren't real. They're just they're basically like an alphabet, right? It's basically like this word means this. The sounds don't really mean that. So there's certain things in music that does kind of sound like that. Like the major key does sound happier, the minor key does sound sadder, but beyond that, if there's a lot of in between there. If you just say, well, I'm going to play something in the major key, and you need to know because I played a major key that it means it's happy, and you need to know because I played something in the minor key for the purposes of the story it means sad, and you need to know that if I play something tensiony, that means there's danger or there's evil or something. See, that's not real. That's not really the music. That's just kind of like a convention. So although those conventions are kind of useful, they also kind of they're generic. When you make a convention, it's not real. It's not real. It's a convention for the purpose of storytelling. It's just cheating. It's like a shortcut because the music can't tell a story perfectly that's detailed, right? It can only give you general feelings that has to then be included or a story impressed upon it. Possibly one way to do that is with the use of conventions, right? But my point is that what happens, I think, to a lot of people is they start to learn, well, there's different scales. The major scale means that it's a happy thing, and the minor scale is a totally different scale, and it means that we're playing something sad. And then you have these other modes that most people don't know too well, and they basically say, well, the Dorian is even sadder, or also sad, but not as sad maybe because it's got a major part in it. And the Phrygian is like sad, but it's like kind of rocky, kind of because it has that half step or something like, right? We come up with these conventions as though they're completely separate things, but they're not completely separate things is the point, because the Aeolian scale is just, or the minor scale is just another mode. It's the same notes that are in the major scale. So once we learn kind of the conventions, then we need to break that in our mind, because it's kind of like your English teacher in grade school teaching you a rule that works most of the time, but then you realize I can totally break that rule and it sounds cool when I do it. You start to learn figures of speech or something, and you're like, hey, like when I intentionally don't do that, it sounds better, right? Or whatever, right? It's similar here, right? Where we kind of learn these rules, and now you kind of need to break out of the rules and say, wait a sec, I don't need to learn 30 different scales. They're all related to each other, and being able to go between the scales is quite cool, especially for certain types of music like jazz and blues, but also, any other kind of music works like that as well to some degree. So let me go up top. Remember, we're basically going to be thinking of, I still want to think of the major scale as the key that we tie everything to, because that's just a good memory shortcut, because it allows us to pack in 7 modes into one grouping, which is going to make it easier for us kind of to remember. So that's going to be our general, idea with it. And so we're going to learn the major scale. These are going to be the intervals for the major scale. And we looked at before the Mixolydian. That's what we just left from, noting that the Mixolydian has a major third and therefore is a major mode. And we talked about the idea that how exactly could I put that into play if I'm not planning on playing in Mixolydian? I mean, what if I'm a fairly new player? I don't want to play in Mixolydian. I want to play in Aeolian, or the major scale. Ionian, or the major scale, and then Aeolian, the minor scale. How does learning the Mixolydian scale or mode help me in the case where I'm playing in the major scale? And one of the ways that it helps is to know that if you're playing in a major scale, it's useful to play the 1-4-5. The 1-4-5 because they all have the major chord constructions, and that's kind of one definition of like a bluesy progression would be a 1-4-5. Most people say, well, the blues kind of comes to mind on that, right? So we're playing a 1-4-5 progression. If I just play the 3 notes, it's going to be a major triad, And that's what most people remember. But we talked about the idea that if I add the other notes that are available in the scale, the 7, the 9, which is equivalent to the 2, the 11, which is equivalent to the 4, the 13, equivalent to the 6, then these don't follow the same convention. In other words, you're not always going to have the major scale, which has a major third, which will have a major 7, 9, 11, and a 13. And the minors will not always have a minor 7, 9, 11, and 13. So the first one people focus on usually is the 7th, because that's going to give you that kind of bluesy feeling, or like a tensiony kind of feeling. And we know that on the 1, 4, 5, the 1 and the 4 have a major 7, and then the 5 has a minor 7, right? Has a minor 7, even though it's a major chord with a minor 7. So what do you do with that knowledge? I can then say, I want to play something. If I'm moving from the 1 to the 4 to the 5, my choices are, do I just want to stick to a triad? In which case, I don't care about the 7, 9, 11, and 13, because whether I think of it as a modal chord, Ionian to Lydian to Mixolydian, or as though I'm playing in like C major to F major to G major, it's going to be the same 3 notes, because the 1, 3, 5 of both scales are the same. But if I add like the 7, what are my options? Well, then I could say I'm going to add the 7 that's in the key, which means in the case of a C major, it would be the 1 would have a major 7, an 11 note away major 7. The 4, which would have the F, right, on the F chord, would have also an 11 note away major 7, but the 5 would then have a minor 7, which means you're not going to have the same uniform chord construction if you do that. So you're losing kind of like the parallelness, but you're gaining symmetry across. So that symmetry is going to, your ear picks up on the symmetry. The ratios are all the same, even though the notes aren't in the same key. So that works. So those are your 2 choices, right? When you're moving from chord to chord, do I want to focus more of my time on symmetry, the shapes being the same, and discard the idea of staying in the same key, which means it would be like me going from Ionian to Ionian, the 4, it would be going to C Ionian or major scale, F major scale to G major scale. Do I want to do that? Or do I want to sacrifice the symmetry and instead try to stay in the same key? You're going to get a different feel on both of those things. The blues tends to sacrifice staying in the same key to add symmetry, right? And so that's going to be, and so we talked about, I looked at that with like the G here. If I took this G, let's look at the Mixolydian, like if I look at it from the point of the Mixolydian, we looked at it down here. And if I had the 1, now this is interesting, because if I had the 1, 4, 5 in the Mixolydian, the other way we can think of the blues is now because the 1 is now modal 5, I have a G, which works because that means that if I look at it from a blues standpoint, I have the minor 7. But when I move to the 4 and the 5, then now notice the 4 is going to have a major 7, and then the 5 is not even a major scale. So what is one way that you can think of this? You can think of it as though I'm moving from G Mixolydian to C Mixolydian to D Mixolydian. I'm just going to convert them all to Mixolydians, right? And so that's one way I can do it. So instead, it's like if this G, usually you play it like this, right? In open position. But let's add the 7. If I add the 7, it would be right there. So now I just kind of do that. I'm just focusing on those top 3 notes. And then if I went to the 4, so if I go to the 4 here, it's going to be the C. So let's do it this way by moving it up to the C. Notice if I keep the C, it would be out here, right? So if I went up to the 4 and stayed in the same key, my choice is I can go out here, and now I get a major 7, or I can try to stay kind of in symmetry, keeping the shape the same, right? And then And then when I go to the 5, similarly, I'm going to copy and paste, and the paste, it's actually going to be right here. Now notice the 5 is all out of whack here, right? Because now I'm going to the D, and the D should be a minor chord construction, right? So now I have actually the 3rd is out of whack. But from a 1-4-5 progression in a blues, it's all symmetrical, right? So you can see the shape is exactly the same. Now I just want to point out if I learn the theory stuff, why that's useful, because when I was thinking about this, I started thinking, well, look at what I'm doing here. I'm basically converting a minor, right, a minor chord to a major, and it still sounds kind of good, but I'm playing in like Mixolydian that doesn't even have that 3rd in it because of the symmetry. So then you can kind of expand that idea possibly, and I started thinking, well, what if I added all the notes? Like, what if I did that to the A, right? And I used that same shape here. Usually it would be an A minor, right? So the reason I'm thinking about it in terms of this minor is because now if I was playing in a bluesy major blues, a G major blues, and thinking of it in terms of a G Mixolydian, when I get to the A, which is the 2nd note, it would be a minor, right? But what if I want to keep the symmetry and sacrifice the idea that it's a minor, I can keep it as major, right? I can be over here. There's the A minor. I can kind of throw that in, and the idea would be it still kind of works because the construction's all the same. So, and the reason I point that out is because when you're looking at something like in a blues or in a jazz situation, it seems to me that a lot of times we learn these little tricks. You're like, whoa, that sounds cool. That little trick sounds cool. But I have no idea like what they were doing. Even this first little progression. When I learned that was adding like a 7 in it, like I didn't really understand, right, when it goes. Like I didn't really understand what exactly was happening there, and so I learned the progression. I was like, that's cool, because I recognize it. I understand the progression. It sounds right. I just memorized the shape, but I didn't really understand conceptually what was going on with it. And a lot of like the little turnarounds that the blues does and stuff, we put all these little tricks, these tricks in our bag. But if you memorize all those little tricks as though they're separate things, and we don't see the thread in terms of why it works, then one, it's going to be difficult to remember them because we have to memorize more things, more different things that aren't associated to anything else. If I learn a trick here and I'm like, I'm playing this, I know I'm in the key of A in that case, but I don't know exactly why it works, then I have to memorize something that is not tied into anything else, right? Whereas if I knew it conceptually why it works, then I can see it, I can build on my thinking. It's easier to remember because I can tie it to something that just cognitively, I'm tying it to something that's already in my mind, right? And if I can figure out the concept of it, then I can also apply that concept elsewhere. And that's what I was trying to get to here, right? Where I'm learning, I started thinking as I do these presentations, I'm thinking, hey, wait a sec, I keep on explaining the fact that this shape is symmetrical. What if I took that to a new level, right? What if I took every note in my key, like every note in the key, and I said, I don't care if it's a major or a minor, I'm just gonna play it as though it's a 7. I'm not going to care if it's a 1, 4, 5. I'm just going to play all of them that way, right? Right, it sounds a little muddy. So you don't, so right, it's gonna, but kind of works, right? So that, I just want, so the general things, like if you keep looking at this shape and saying, man, you keep going over the same shape, note that a couple things that we can do to kind of add flavor to the shape is, one, we can add the half steps in play. So usually when I think of a half step, we think about the blues notes as the big half step that we can add, but we can also add a half step any time. So I can always kind of, like if I'm playing in an A minor, let's get down to our minor now. If I'm playing in an A minor, like here's an A right here. If I play the A minor this way, I can always, add a minor. And I just want to point out this example I've been kind of tinkering with as well, is if I took this as my, this and this is basically a power chord. Notice if I go back to this string, and then I have the open D that I might play as well, and then I go back to this string and back to an A, that's all in the same key, right? So I could do something like, now let's say, well, what if as I'm walking down, I add the I add the half step. So now I'm going from here to here, and then I'm going to add this half step, which is outside of the key, and I'm going to slide into the A just to give it a little bit more flavor, right? So I added another D note right there. Right, so now I'm adding a little bit of flavor with just the half step. So this one happens to be the bluesy half step, but this one doesn't. These are the two half steps I would start off with, right? This one happens to be leading into the A, but you could do it anywhere. I can lead into this G to this one. This happens to be the blue note, but I can do a half step anywhere, right? I can even do a half step with the whole chord. So here's the chord. So I can take that whole chord and slide into it. I can go the other way even. Like I could make it a shaky chord by going off the chord and back on it. Right. Like whatever I'm on, I can kind of do that and add a little bit of flavor to it. So we have the half step that we can do, and when we're in the minor key, we don't have the half step going home, so I add that all the time, right? So we can always kind of add that half step going home, just as a few things to just kind of keep in mind as we go. All right. Let's get going to the next one here. So the general idea, let's look at the intervals. So the intervals for the major that we will contrast the minor to. The major has a 0 note away perfect first, a 2 note away minor second, a 4 note away major third, a 5 note away perfect fourth, a 7 note away perfect fifth, 9 note away major sixth, 11 note away major seventh. What would we expect the minor, the Aeolian, which normally we would think would be the furthest distance away from the major? You would think would be the opposite of the major. And nicely, the system has been set up so the perfects remain the same, typically on the majors and minors, or in major scale versus the minor scale. And then you would think that all of the ones that are majors would flip and be flattened one step back to be the minor, and that's what happens, except with the second. For whatever reason, the second is still a major second. So it's kind of funny the way that works, because actually the Phrygian is the most opposite of the major scale, because it's the same, except it does have a flat second in it, but the major scale does not. And we want to think about the major scale as the scale that we compare all the minors to. So once I learn the minor scale, which is the Aeolian, then I can compare Dorian and Phrygian to it, And that's the easiest thing to do from that perspective because there's only going to be one interval difference between the other two minor scales and the main minor, otherwise known as the Aeolian mode or minor scale. All right, so let's go down to the minor scale. So the minor scale then has a perfect first. They all have a perfect first. Still has a 2-note away major second. That's the weird one. You're like, why isn't it a 1-note away minor second? Well, it's just that's the one we have to kind of keep aware of. That's the one that has a 2-note. But it has a 3-note away minor third instead of a 4-note away major third. That's what we would expect. It still has the same 5-note away perfect fifth, 7-note away 5-note away perfect fourth, 7-note away perfect fifth. That's what we would expect. It has an 8-note away minor 6 instead of the major scale, which has a 9-note away major 6, and therefore we flattened it, took it down a step. And then it has a 10-note away minor 7, which is what we would expect because the major scale has an 11-note away major 7, and we just flattened it. So that's what we would expect as well. So we're going to go through all of these from, again, the perspective at the bottom.